Well, welcome to this episode of whatever the hell we're going to call this in post. I'll drop whatever we call it in post or leave it like this as an artifact of how unsure we were of ourselves at this point. But this is going to be a show about influences. It's going to be a show about the things that get into your fucking head while it's still soft. We're going to focus on one of the ones that Bill is bringing us today. This wormed its way into his head when he was a kid. And somebody said, a great comics historian said, the first stories you see in comics have a propensity to be the most powerful. And I think that might be why we're going to have this conversation about this particular topic. So take it away, Bill. What are we talking about today?
Well, we are talking about the first long-form story I really ever fell in love with in comics. Certainly the first one that I ever picked up issue to issue and just remember that visceral excitement of, oh my God, I can't wait to pick up the next part of this story, even when I got completely confused as to what the next part of the story was.
Which was not your fault, because I think the people writing it were confused.
It was a story that ran through like 8 or 10 different comics and encompassed so many different miniseries and weird offshoots. We are talking about the Clone Saga, bane of the 90s. Some would say the beginning of the end for Marvel Comics as they went down the rabbit hole of multi-year, multi-part crossovers.
Although weirdly, one of the best-selling sagas they'd ever had.
Sure. It's interesting because it's like there's so much wrapped up into this that we can talk about, because this was also like their direct response to the Image revolution. Like this was the first big thing that they did after they lost Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson off the Spider books.
Right.
So,
can I jump in right here and say this is what they did, in my opinion? They said, oh, some seminal creators left us. Well, we have 80,000 assholes here, and we could make so much shit so fast. Fuck y'all. You'll never be able to match this with your laissez-faire, draw when you want to, drive your Ferrari when you want to, ass lifestyle you guys got right now. We're going to beat your ass in the sheer, like how the Russians beat the French type shit. You know what I'm saying?
just overpowering numbers, if not quality, for sure. So, and for any listeners who aren't as familiar with this as we are, like the broad strokes of the Clone Saga is that in 1975 there was a kind of a big story going on in the Spider-Man titles dealing with the fallout of the death of Gwen Stacy, but a smaller piece of that was this story of the Jackal, who was a mad geneticist cloning Spider-Man. And so there's a spider clone in 1975 that Spider-Man, he dies and Spider-Man ends up dropping him down the smokestack of a factory to burn up the body and erase all the evidence. And it was kind of considered a failed story at the time. And so they never really revisited it. And 20 years later, that becomes the basis for the Clone Saga. And super broad strokes, the clone comes back, Aunt May dies, Spider-Man...
Or does she?
Well, right, or does she? Spider-Man has sort of a crisis of conscience. The presence of the clone is revealed. They have some weird sort of like contentious, turns into brotherly sort of relationship. And then at the same time as they're sort of mending their relationship, it's revealed that the clone, or who they thought was the clone, was the original. And so the Peter Parker that we had known since 1975 was the clone from that story, and they had just gotten swapped in the fight. And so the original Spider-Man was the one who got dropped down the smokestack. So Mary Jane is pregnant at the time. Peter and Mary Jane leave New York. He hangs up his spider tights. Ben Reilly the clone, or the real Peter Parker, becomes Spider-Man. And then through a series of machinations, it's revealed that, first of all, Peter and Mary Jane come back, and then the results of whether or not who's the real Peter Parker come into question. And it turns out that Norman Osborn, who at this point had been dead for 20 years also, the original Green Goblin.
Right after Gwen Stacy.
Exactly. was still alive the whole time, and he had been coordinating all of this as a way to mess with Spider-Man. And Ben Reilly actually was a clone, and Ben Reilly dies, and now Peter Parker retakes the mantle of Spider-Man, and the original Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, is back, which was a very consequential decision because Norman Osborn would go on to play a huge part in Marvel Comics, I mean, to this day, but like at one point, he was the government-appointed head of the Avengers. He created the Dark Avengers, led to a big crossover event years and years after the Clone Saga. But that's the broad strokes that happened over the course of, like I said, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and that pregnancy was not anything to discount because it was the very first time that they had introduced the concept that spider jizz could fuck her up, you know, because in Spider-Man Reign, she actually dies because of his exposure to radiation, let's say it classy, and its residual effects on her. They introduced that thing, and then, but there was also, like, I just want to say this point. Villains are useless. They're all fucking useless. They're all useless, especially in this story. But this story shows you how useless villains are when A, they cannot kill the hero because the story can't end, and B, they have to recur a whole bunch and get their ass beat, and C, when you're creating stuff, work for hire, you are not going to give them your best stuff unless you are a dumb ass motherfucker, or if you're one of those rare people who can get a good, I think they call it benefit check instead of royalty check. They don't like to call the checks that they get because they created such and such character. They don't like to call them royalty checks. They call them something else. But if you have a rare deal where you actually get something for when they spin that character off and everything, maybe. But Judas Traveler is what happens when you don't give a fuck.
So that was bad. The Traveler guy?
Wait, so Ron, you asked me before what got me into this story.
Yeah.
I'm going to just come right out and say it. One of the main things that I was so intrigued by in this story was frickin' Judas Traveler and Scryer.
Was it the hair? Was it the mullet? Was it the two belts?
I don't really know. We got to get into this. We got to get into this because I'm going to be figuring it out real time on the air here because I don't know. But let me just tell you, every issue of the Clone Saga that I picked up that did not give some piece of Judas Traveler's backstory, I was angry. I was dying to put the pieces together. Who is this guy? What does he want? Why can he do the things he does? I was all in. How
did you feel when you found out he was a mutant?
I didn't. This is the crazy thing, right? So I got so pissed because they kept just dragging it on. And like, keep in mind, this is also in this time period, I started to collect Spawn. And in Spawn, they had this character called Cagliostro, who was very much like a Judas Traveler type. Like he was this long bearded, wizened kind of old, they always intimated that he was ancient and he knew things about heaven and hell and the everything about it that like, but you never really knew his backstory, and they gave you little bits and pieces too. And that always intrigued me about Spawn. And so when I saw Judas Traveler show up, my head was going, because they cast it as like he was some ancient, powerful entity, quasi-religious figure. So, at the time too, like I was super into like mythology and whatever. So I'm like, oh man, I was licking my chops. Like, is he gonna be like some character from the Bible or something? And they're gonna work that into the story. And it got to the point where like I realized, and it was late. I mean, it was late into all this, but I realized because there was an issue that they published that was supposed to be like the secrets of Scryer revealed or whatever. Ooh. And I think I went as far as they showed that Scryer wasn't just Judas Traveler's like Robin. There was a whole brotherhood of them. So there was like dozens of Scryers, and they were like the power behind Traveler. But I read that issue and I was like, this didn't tell me anything. This gave me no answers. And I was so pissed that like, that was where I was like, you know what? I'm out. I'm out on Judas Traveler. I'm out. And I think the next time I picked up a Clone Saga book was the Revelation storyline that wrapped up the Norman Osborn thing and revealed once and for all who's the real and who was the clone. But like, I dipped out of, I want to say maybe like the last quarter of the whole big omnibus because the Judas Traveler thing sucked me in and then pushed me out because it was so mishandled.
That's interesting because, like the first season of Lost.
Very much that, yes.
I loved the first season of Lost. I was like, what is happening? These mysteries, this is so interesting. And then the first 2 episodes of season 2, I was like, oh, I'm never watching this again. If you're going to give me literally no information about anything and just ask more questions, I'm gone. I'm done.
It's that exact phenomenon.
It's also very clear, though. Let's be nice. It's also very clear that they don't know what that guy can do at all, and they're making it up as they go along. Yeah, because like I swear I read a bunch of this shit like really soon, like the last 2 days, so it's fresh in my mind. And one of the I think it might have been Web of Spider-Man. It all sort of blends together too. It's in the Ravencroft, the thing where like they entice Spider-Man. Basically, that's another thing. The Ravencroft like Institute or some shit. Yeah. It's like Spider-Man's Arkham.
Totally.
They totally made it Spider-Man's Arkham. So it's a bunch of people in there just going, spiders, I'll never defeat him. There's a bunch of assholes doing that stick. And so like he's going to unleash him Bane style, literally Bane style and Arkham, Asylum style on Spider-Man and like soften him up or whatever the fuck. And then he gets, anyway, Spider-Man punches him like 16 times. And that dude would be dead as fuck. But I guess because he's got illusion casting powers, as we find out later, maybe, because, and it's just like, they thought that I think you're right, Bill. I think somebody planned for him to be a god. And then somebody else is like, nah.
Nope.
Listen, it very much was that thing of like, let's plant some tantalizing seeds and then figure out how to write ourselves out of it later, which, to be fair, is classic comic book storytelling. I mean, Chris Claremont says, like, I used to do that shit all the time in X-Men, where I would just like tease something and then I would just have to come back and figure out what I meant by that tease. Yeah. And honestly, there's not really anything wrong with doing that. It's part of that soap opera storytelling, right? It's just when you don't stick the landing, you lose even the 4th graders in the audience, because I was right there with it.
But also, one last thing on Judas, it just seems like there are styles of villains for the character, and they can contrast. They're like contrasting or complementary colors, right? Sometimes the villain is kind of like your hero, and that's cool, and it looks good juxtaposed next to each other. And sometimes the character is so far away from him. But this weird pirate sash, bitch-ass motherfucker fighting Spider-Man, I never bought it. Kraven, I get. Spider-Man's a creature. Catch the creature. Rhino, creature fighting another creature. Octopus, same thing. You can go down the line.
Yeah.
Judas Traveler...
Venom hates Spider-Man. It makes sense. He's sort of like him, but he's not like him.
Yeah, but he's like Judas Traveler and select others. Sometimes I think those motherfuckers from that weird dimension where they eat spiders, I don't like those dudes either. Their design
that one's interesting to me. But at least it makes sense.
They're Judas Traveler graduated. I'll give you that. Yeah. The dudes who the spider eater, what are they called?
That's like the J. Michael Straczynski thing, right? Yeah, with the totems.
Yeah.
Well, and the dudes that like
it's almost like the One.
Well, yeah, yes, it is like Jet Li's the One.
Yeah, because he went and like each time somebody died, he got that much stronger, and so those totems are just killing other totems to become the best totem.
Well, let's discuss Ben Reilly, guys. Let's discuss Ben Reilly, because obviously Ben Reilly was who they were selling the little bills on.
Totally.
And let's discuss his design as a character. We're not going to go all the way to Blondie yet. We're talking about when he's first out. He's got Spider-Man gloves for some reason, because I guess he got like part of the costume when he decided to leave.
I think it was like because he was dumped down the smokestack in the costume, but I think the costume was like damaged. And so it's like he saved what he could. And basically it just came down to like he had web shooters and gloves. And so he could do some stuff, but that was basically it.
So like he gets out of that and he wanders the earth, and it's so funny how long they make the 5 years feel. Oh, like I was out for 5 years, and like the ones where like he's like I read a story, an untold story of Ben Reilly. He was on a bus and he was with a fat guy who was telling him all of his problems. And Ben Reilly was like, why don't you shut the fuck up? Ben Reilly talked and they did the little squigglies to make curse words. Ben Reilly had just experienced the fact that he was a fucking clone, the fact that everybody loved somebody else besides him, and he was on a bus to nowhere. And this guy wants to talk, eat a dick. Long story short, they have this nice little one issue story where he ends up, he tells that guy off so many times that and basically then his spider sense twist, they get stranded, they get into a motel, the same motel with each other. His spider sense goes off, he goes to check on the guy for some reason, kicks open the door, and the guy's about to kill himself, and he snatches the gun out of his mouth. And he said, well, you're the one who told me I was worthless. It's like, I was drunk. Yeah, Ben Reilly got drunk with a stranger, and Peter Parker never drank, so he got real good and drunk and like fucked up the bar. He like threw a 1-ton table and smashed some shit, and a dude pulled a gun on him and he smacked it out of his hand. Like, he was reacting really spidery. Anyway, he saves this guy, and then he starts to realize, no matter what I do, I'm a good guy that tries to help people. So even though I'm a nomad, this helping people shit is never going to stop following me. It was a really moving story.
Listen, man, I was so in the bag for that when I was reading this stuff. Just that, and I don't know if it was true at the time in the mid 90s or if it was just my naivete that like made me think it was true. But I was enamored with that idea of like getting lost in the American West. You know what I mean? Like just hopping on a bus and you just end up in the middle of nowhere in some no-name town, and like whoever you were in New York or the big city just didn't matter anymore, and just like living by your own rules in a cabin sort of a thing.
Let me tell you, I've lived that life.
Well, so yeah, it was real. But
New York, New Mexico, Albuquerque is basically what you just said. No, it's not that bad, but yeah, that shit's not as fun as and people think it is. But I totally get it though. That's the other thing is like, you totally get him in a lot of ways, because who are you if you're not your memories?
Well, it's also a very simple thing of like, you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's you think you're this thing, and then they tell you, no, you're not that thing. You're some second-rate copy of that thing, and nobody gives a crap about you.
You're
it's
gonna
like,
lick pizza, like multiplicity.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. But like I think there was something very relatable from the beginning, and also just the fact, like Ed said, that they played him as a dude who, despite how awful his life had went and how he just like on a fundamental level, you understood that he lacked a certain self-regard. Like he himself believed like, I shouldn't exist, and yet he couldn't help but try to be a good dude. And there was like, what a sweet spot of both the great darkness of the 90s, but then also just like that inspirational superhero thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things too. I mean, again, this is, we've talked about this before, but like I relate in a lot of ways, because when you're a kid, when I was a kid, I did a bunch of terrible things. But those terrible things weren't like who I was as a person. They were me acting out of insecurity and stuff like that. Because the other thing I did was stand up for lots of people, and stand up, for my brother, and stand up for whoever I, cared about or whatever. And you that when you're in a mindset, it's so easy to forget who you are as a person. And it can take something as simple as that to bring it back. And that's what's so nice about a story like that. So,
yeah. And it just shows you that all these, we are really, and that's why I started off with that Judas Traveler disc, because when you really look at comics, it is not the villains. That's why there's so many of them. That's why it takes so many of them to fuck with the heroes. The heroes are they're formed though by these adventures versus the villains. And then you see Ben Reilly, for a while he didn't even have that. They had him off doing weird shit, but then that you talk about the sweet spot, you get to have new Spider-Man, angsty, low self-esteem like most of the kids are, and then you get to have him build up. It's like when you fuck up your save on a video game and you go and you just grit your teeth and you pound right back through it. Fuck it, I'll do this over again. I'll do it even better. We as kids, I wasn't quite the kid you were, but like I did appreciate that on some level. After a couple issues, I was like, this is ugly comics. these guys don't draw as good as the other guys that don't know how to draw, but I like more. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just kind of was out of it, but I could appreciate the fact that you got to watch Spider-Man, because the thing is, even by the 90s, Spider-Man was the best hero. He was the best at being the best a lot of the time. Sometimes he would get slashed or beat up a little bit and they would make it a big deal. But most of the time he could handle a lot of his villains and make jokes. It was a joke. Unless they were threatening Aunt May or doing something serious, it was kind of a joke. Craven would bury him every now and again, but it was kind of a joke. This guy was fighting certain people that Spider-Man could barely fuck with, like Venom. One of the first putovers was Ben Reilly finally beating Venom. Yeah,
I want to talk about that.
Let's talk about that.
Well, that was my introduction to the Clone Saga. That was the first. Yeah, that was the first storyline that I picked up that sucked me in, and it was the story where he got the Scarlet Spider costume, which was dope.
He still is.
He debuted the impact webbing, which was like these little compact balls that he could shoot out of his spider or out of his web shooters, and they would explode into like a net of webbing. And then, it was him going after Venom in a way that really encapsulated all this stuff we're talking about. Like, he got his butt whooped. He was dealing with like, I'm not good enough. Like, this isn't my fight, but I got to do something anyway, like struggling to just find his identity and his place. And he takes down Venom in what I thought was an interesting way, using the impact webbing, where it's like he's able to shoot the impact webbing between the symbiote and Eddie Brock. And then when it explodes, it like forces the symbiote off of Eddie Brock's body, and that gives him an opening to knock him out. So already you're like, oh, this character with that inherent darkness, with these personal struggles, with this weird ingenuity, takes down like the pinnacle of cool, badass Spider-Man villains.
Yep.
Again, not to say it was the best written thing ever, but for me, what a debut. Like, that got its hooks in me, man.
Well, and it's so interesting, like, what can get your hooks in you? You know, I mean, like, honestly, the first Spider-Man comic I read had some dinosaurs. It was like literally designed for, like, it was like one of those Spider-Man comics where it was like Spider-Man Through Time or something like that. Like, it was a 70s comic book that I just got for cheap at some 7-Eleven or something like that. And actually it was a Circle K because we were in Albuquerque. And it was like, I mean, it was not good for sure. But it was also like this story of him like helping out each like time period and teaching some kind of thing or something like that. I think it's like literally a one-off Spider-Man book. I could picture the cover right now.
Spider-Man is the best character for those like weird grocery store, like it's free for some reason because it's anti-drugs or anti-being fat or whatever the fuck this whatever the president's wife is all got her panties in a bunch about. That's what the fuck this comic book is about. And like I had one where it might have had an environmental message. I don't really remember, but long story boring, it was the Hulk and Spider-Man happened to be in the same place for some reason. I'm not going to try to remember. And then Kraven the Hunter perceived that the Hulk was there and tried to capture him. And they ended up, he ended up actually being able to get Hulk into a grain silo that had him have no leverage, where he could kind of do a sedative or some weird shit happened. That was my first Spider-Man story. Spider-Man being outshined by the Hulk in his own story. And then having to basically save the Hulk from one of his lesser villains. That was one of my very first entrees to Spider-Man. So he's great for that.
Yeah. And I want to also give a shout out. A lot of the art in the Clone Saga is subpar.
It is,
but that Venom.
I mean, I'm sorry, guys, but if it looks like Spider-Man to me, it's pretty good. Well,
we can get into that. On the opposite tip, though, I did want to give a shout out. That little 4-part Scarlet Spider versus Venom was drawn by Tom Lyle, who I think was one of the better Spider-Man artists of the time. And he very much was sort of working in the tradition of Eric Larson, but I think did a better Spider-Man than Larson did. I really enjoyed his artwork. And I don't remember if he designed, I think Bagley designed the Scarlet Spider outfit, but Tom Lyle was the first one to draw it in the book. and he nailed it. I mean, he drew a spider, again, very much like Larson, that had the same design elements of the Todd McFarlane Spider-Man, the really big eyes, the really closely rendered webbing. So there's just a ton of it all over him. You know, a little bit beefier than other guys, certainly beefier than like Bagley would draw him or like Humberto Ramos in more recent times. But Tom Lyle at the time, I want to say, you know, he drew those like round, taut muscles that for whatever reason, like just sink their hooks into you as a kid. And he also had this rendering style that just was cool, where he would use like the thick graphic fields of black for shadow, but then would have like those parallel lines that would sort of fade into a secondary light source. We don't need to go full art nerd, but I just remember there being so much of what Tom Lyle did that I would go on to like really try to copy in my own art and sketchbooks and stuff, because I just thought it was so dope.
That's awesome.
Well, as somebody who likes comic art, I think it's still one of those things where it's the roundness. Kids love roundness. It's what got Liefeld over to a great degree. They love roundness and they like a graphic quality. Yeah, that's what kids like.
I agree with that. A lot of sharp parallel lines, and yeah, a lot of round forms. Totally.
I will say there were a couple of comics I read where Peter Parker sort of looked like Guile. Like he was because he had this like flat top hair sometimes, where I was like, why does he have a flat top?
Well, they were trying to, you know what was so funny to me going back and reading these 90s comics is to watch the artists try. They were trying to do like, it was either some kind of spiky, almost David Bowie-ish type of thing sometime. But that sometimes they would still try to keep the two little ringlets. Right. Remember they used to, back in the Russ Andrew days, and they used to draw two little ringlets, like two Superman curls that were truncated on his head.
Just like two, my hair's too long, but yeah, just basically like right here, he just have like two little pieces of hair.
Dude, and to see the 90s artists try to retain that on some level as they continually mulletize this fucking guy was beautiful. It was beautiful to see them try to mend the times.
No, it's funny because like we've talked a little off air. This really was the thing that got me into the hobby of comic book collecting. I wouldn't say that this like sparked my love of superheroes. This didn't spark my love of art. Like there was nothing about the quality of this, even at the time, that captured my imagination. I think I was already down the rabbit hole with those things. But this was the first time that I remember I had to get to the comic book store every Wednesday. And so from a business perspective, it was working, because really that's all that they're after as a business.
Ron, you said that it was a great seller, and I was like, well, name your goal and ye shall achieve it. Like they didn't set out to make great comics. They said, fuck y'all, we're gonna sell. We're gonna have so many comics, and as Bill stated so eloquently, I was past Spider-Man at that point. I wasn't in that world, but there were other things that I was picking up with that exact same.
I was past Spider-Man.
No, I mean past as in fucking old. Those weren't for me. You know what I'm saying? It's like Power Rangers. I'm not past Power Rangers. The shit came out too late.
No, but I think that's an important point, Ed, because I look back at this and I see something happening in my own experience that people are constantly bemoaning never happens in mainstream comics. And namely, that is, I was a fourth grade kid who got sucked into mainstream comics by this storyline. And, you know, I feel like the narrative since that time, since before that time, has been like, we can't get kids to read comics. And, you know, we've talked about it many times on different shows that we've done, like, when they grab you when your brain is soft, as Ed likes to say, they put their hooks in you. And this story had a lot going for it for a soft-brained kid. Number one, it straight up did the thing that everybody hated about it, which was everything you knew up to this point no longer matters. Let's throw it out. And now we're going to give you this brand new shiny thing, and you're going to have to discover how it works all on your own. If you had been reading Spider-Man up to that point, I understand how that is a huge insult to you. But for me, as somebody who only knew Spider-Man, in his platonic form from cartoons and stuff, that was amazing. I was like, yes, please do that. Do all of that. That's exactly what I need to fall in love with this thing. So, again,
and let's talk about, like, it did a couple of other things too. Like, on a simple basis, it put multiple different looking characters that were Spider-Man into it.
Yeah. And by the way,
Scarlet Spider.
What movie does that sound like?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the best, like, as far as it comes out, that, the Spider-Verse was sick.
Yeah.
So, like, it's one of those things where, like, you got to see a couple different Spider-Mans, a couple different, like, weird heroes. Was it Spider-Side and Kane? And Kane is actually kind of cool. Like,
Kane survives to this day in the Spider-Man books in one form or another.
Dude, Kane was designed to be cool.
Oh yeah.
The very first time he appears, the caption says pain. And then the next time you see him, you get this list of, like, he is made of pain. Pain is his main attribute. Pain. And it's like, as a kid, you're just like, fuck yeah.
Exactly. I was going to say, that's the other thing, is this kid, all these adults, which we all strive to be, right? As children, we're always looking towards the future, one day when we can control our own destinies. Even then, you don't get to control your destiny because you don't even know what your destiny is. Like, there's just this great angst in it, and a terrible angst, by the way. Like, you go back and read it and you're like, where's the Spider-Man who makes jokes while he's punching the Sandman in the face? But at the same time, he's this crazy Spider-Man who's conflicted because he doesn't know who he is. And how many kids relate to not knowing who they are?
Oh, I mean, the interesting thing about Kane is, like, Kane is what happens when you try to apply the black and white indie comic sensibility to a mainstream superhero. I mean, Kane is basically the Crow meets Spider-Man.
I heard that basically the only reason why Kane exists, more or less, is Terry Kavanagh and Howard Mackey, I think.
Yeah, Howard Mackey.
They were talking and they were like, the Jackal is a fucking bitch. Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing. They're like, the Jackal is a fucking bitch. And there ain't no goddamn way we're going to be able to build no long-ass story with this bitch-made motherfucker fighting two Spider-Mans. It just ain't going to be. And they were like, fuck, dog, you right. So let's, like, make somebody that can kick Ben Reilly and Spider-Man's motherfucking ass. And that's Kane. And they just start freestyling it over the phone at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And they made up Kane as the actual muscle to, like, push some of the danger in the story so they would have something to refer to.
I think he was their brother and who killed Cain and Abel. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it is worth noting, though, that, like, you really do see that what started in 1986 with Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen and the explosion of independent comics, I think it comes home to roost in a lot of ways here in the mid-90s. And the Clone Saga started in 1994. And really, I mean, when Ben Reilly finally died and they put an end to, like, his whole storyline, I think it was almost 1997, if not 1998. And so you're looking at 4 to 5 years of stories that this really encompassed. And over that time, I think you do see the mainstream. It's like this whole idea, right, of tortured superheroes from Watchmen and, like, the gritty sort of, like, I'm going to fight my way through an unfair world of the Dark Knight Returns, and, like, the violence and the tortured soul of the indie comics. It's like, this is where, and I don't think in a corporate way even, I think, you talk about Mackey and Kavanaugh sitting down to invent Kane. I think it's just by that point, that ethos had so suffused comics, was so the hot thing in comics, that everybody was just thinking that way. And it's a little bit like when indie music goes mainstream, right? It's like, that's the moment when it's dead. And so when you've got the main writers on the monthly Spider-Man comics coming up with, like, a tortured superhero whose past was ripped away from him, so he dresses in an all-black suit and uses his powers to rip people's faces off, then you know that you have jumped the shark.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Well, and it's also interesting how like that's that take on the indie thing, by the way, you know, like when Nirvana decided to get on the radio, they were no longer Nirvana. Like, I get that attitude.
Also
like,
happening at that same time, by the way, which is interesting, but go on.
Yeah. And Metallica's the same way. A lot of people hate the Black Album with the older albums that were just much like more hardcore, but like metal wouldn't have even come into the mainstream for people to check out a little bit without that album coming out, arguably, right? So like my point is, it's just a weird position because all of us here right now, we all want to be not only successful, but financially successful, right?
But sell out, baby.
That's the thing. It's like, is it sell out or is it not sell out? When because they sat down and came up with a character to work with the story that they had to work with in this a creative a way as possible. But like, you could still look at them and be like, sellouts, right?
I don't even think it's that, right? Because it's not really sellouts, because it's not like Mackie and Kavanaugh were doing Kane out of their garage and then Marvel came to them and were like, hey, let's integrate this into Spider-Man.
Yeah.
That's not really what I'm talking about. It's more like, it's not so much like Nirvana going on MTV. It's the second generation of bands that were all influenced by Nirvana on MTV.
100%.
That's what we're talking about.
It's
Puddle of Mud.
Puddle of Mud and Creed.
Yeah, exactly.
Three Doors Down.
Well, Three Doors Down has some okay stuff, but
dude, I knew as soon as you listed more than two bands, we were going to get into white boy defense territory.
Well, and let's also talk about that, because I know that sounds weird, like but there are people who genuinely love the Clone Saga, genuinely love Ben Reilly as a character.
Well, and so I think there's merit to Ben Reilly as a character, certainly, but I also just want to make the point before we move off this topic, like, as much as the Clone Saga was sort of like this cynical, watered down amalgamation of trends that were done better and sooner elsewhere, it was the thing that pushed me, and I'm sure a lot of people like me as readers, toward those other better things, because it was an accessible thing. There's no big, especially at the time, there's no bigger comic book superhero than Spider-Man. And like, yes, it is very much an inferior product to even something, say, like The Crow, right? But I wouldn't have gone into comics as deep as I did, which led me to those sorts of works, without having the entry drug of the Clone Saga. And so I think, again, from a creative and from sort of a fan perspective, I think that's useful to keep in mind when you start to react to these things like, oh my God, what a cynical cash grab, or oh my God, what a watered down BS version of this thing. That can all be true, but that doesn't automatically mean that something shouldn't exist or shouldn't be done.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, especially when you're, I was just going to say, especially when you're talking about something like this soap operatic sort of thing that has to be churned out. The fact that there's any art at all to this shit, that's the last point on this thing I would want to make. The fact that there's any art to this shit at all. The fact that it made anybody feel anything, with 4 different editors, with 5-10 different art teams doing stuff. They would hand each other plots like, here you go, motherfucker, follow that. What the fuck? You ripped his arms off? Oh, shit. They were having to do shit like that all the time. They were not coordinated like that. 4 different editors, one Danny Fingeroth at the top, and then a bunch of capos pulling fucking strings like the Godfather logo, and not always not bumping the puppets into each other. Sometimes the puppets clashed and they fucked up and the wires got tangled and they had to work it out because the fucking comic had to come out next week, bitch.
Yeah.
And they said stuff like they would have 3-hour meetings and get 5 pages of material out of it, and they were like killing themselves because of editorial fucking with them and shit.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting because I heard before at some point here, I'm going to ask you, Bill, when you first started reading them, what attracted to you. But before that, So keep that in mind. But before that, I just kind of wanted to mention like how interesting you said soap operatic. And I don't know if you know this, and I actually not 100% sure this is true. I just had a guy who wrote for soap operas tell me this. He told me that they have two teams of writers. The first team writes the problems. The second team has to get them out of the problems.
I mean, look, from an assembly line standpoint, from an assembly line standpoint, I get it, because like the thing about soap operas is you got to have, a big old chunk of story every single day. I mean, the churn and burn on those things is crazy. So yeah, I mean, you almost turn the writing into like a Ford assembly line where, all right, you're going to make the bumpers and you're going to make the windows and you're going to put it all together. Like, I get it. That makes sense. And
it sounds like if Marvel had done that, maybe it would have been a tiny bit more organized, but maybe they kind of did that. Like, because each editorial team had to come in and be like, okay, how do I get Spider-Man out of him actually being the clone? How do I get Peter Parker out of actually being the clone to him being Spider-Man again?
Oh, yeah.
How do I do that? How do I get Ben Reilly to be cool with being a clone, but also still love Aunt May? What the?
Yeah, there's so much inconsistency in the art throughout this, these various books, like especially going from, Tom Lyle and Mark Bagley are complementary. They certainly are not the same art, but going from like Mark Bagley to Sal Buscema is like, I mean, it's like going from John Byrne to Bill Sienkiewicz. It's like it's going from a guy who has very much like a classy, cartoon superhero vibe, which is Bagley, to a guy who works with like literally scratching his quill pen across the page, which was Sal Buscema. And it confused the hell out of me, I got to say, as a kid, because I'm like, why does this look so different? Like, why? And some of it looked so ugly, especially if you're looking for like round fluid forms and a real graphic quality. Then you end up with like that over-rendered, ink-heavy, very free-form, sketchy, scratchy sort of art. And you're like, I have no time for, I don't want to truck with this at all.
And some of that I know for a fact, because I just, again, read these shits, was inked by Bill Sienkiewicz.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Dude, Bill Sienkiewicz inked a lot of the Sal Buscema shit in that time frame, because again, think about it. And then it got to breakdown stages too. Mm-hmm. It got to Sal Buscema breakdowns, which for anybody who doesn't know, breakdowns is when the artist is just like, hey, his fucking head, shoulders, fucking legs, light pole, building, here, finish it up. And
sketches,
so
basically.
Yeah. And so basically he was working on, so Bill Sienkiewicz working on a weekly schedule on his off days of doing whatever esoteric bullshit he's doing with his beautiful art. And he's coming in to ink these breakdowns of Sal Buscema. I mean, there's so much distance between that and Tom Lyle. I get what you're saying. I liked it a lot better, to tell you the truth, but I'm old and I knew who Bill Sienkiewicz was.
Right. Yeah. I again, like, you're never going to put Tom Lyle up, in the hall of great comic book artists necessarily, but it was an art style that I think grabbed me as a kid and created a fascination just in the way he drew bodies and the way he drew action and the way he drew muscles and whatever it was.
Yeah, I mean, calf muscles especially. He had
those calf muscles,
bulbous, like balloon animals. Somebody twisted you a fucking balloon animal.
Well, now I know exactly who you're talking about.
Cantaloupe on a stick. I mean, that was how he drew that lower portion of the leg.
That sounds great. That's how I tried to draw it when I was a kid. You could see both muscles and stuff, like.
Dude, Spider-Man was
split
all
down the
quads, quads and calves.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so Ben Reilly shows up, and again, from the put-over standpoint, right? He jobs out Venom, and for me, it was kind of off to the races, and again, like the 1-2 punch of that, and then you get into the Judas Traveler and Scryer mystery of it all, and like, oh, there's Teutonic forces at work behind this Clone Saga. And the other third thing that grabbed me really was this idea, because they publicized the hell out of it. I remember reading letters columns and stuff. This idea that we are doing the continuation of a 20-year-old story. This idea of like, we're picking up this throwaway plot thread that nobody's touched since 1975, and now we're going to turn it into an epic. That fired the creative portion of my brain. That's where I sort of learned to, again, I very much loved the idea that like I'm getting in on the ground floor of this thing. But by the same token, that idea that there was years and years of history that you could cherry pick stuff out of and craft a whole new mythology, that I was like, ooh, this is tasty. Like you're not doing that in movies. You know what I mean? Like it was such a unique piece of storytelling that I had to see how it played out. And I think where it lost that momentum was when it got into Mary Jane is pregnant and Peter has the angst over being a father. And then they're going to move away from New York. And kind of honestly, when they moved away from New York, I was like, okay, now we can get back to the real story. And we're through all that BS. Then like when they turned Ben Reilly into the new Spider-Man with costume and everything, it sort of settled into trying to be, all right, now we're going to just pick up doing Spider-Man stories the way everybody knows Spider-Man stories, but now he's blonde and he works in a diner. And it was like, well, what happened to that like grand Teutonic myth you were telling me? Like, where's my answers about Judas Traveler and Scryer? And like, where's the payoff to all this stuff that you were setting up? And they tried to just get it into like the continuing adventures of Spider-Man. And that's where like I said, I sort of dipped out. I was like, all right, you know, you're trying to set me up to just go back to telling friendly neighborhood Spider-Man stories. I wasn't into that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and plus, I think it's one of those things where I think the way that they originally designed the story was the classic thing when they change something that big. Change it for about 6 months, a year. Change it for 6 months, a year and a half, maybe, but more like a year, and then bring it back. This shit got to be 2 years. And I think they wanted to do it like 6 months and then give you a little thrill and then like show you why, kind of what they did with Superior Spider-Man, which I think might have lasted 2 years, but it was more like, hey man, this is what you liked about this guy. We're going to take that away. We're going to give you something cool instead, but you're going to yearn for what we took away. So when we bring it back, it's cool.
Well, and should be said, also what they were doing, I think way more successfully with Superman and Batman. Like the whole reign of the Superman thing, after he dies, here are these 4 new Supermen, and you're either going to like them or hate them, but you're going to get really invested into who they are and what their stories are. And then, and again, say what you will, like that's not the greatest story ever told in comics either, but it was tight and like it was planned out. Maybe too much so, to the point where it felt a little robotic once they got into it. But they did that thing that I was saying I felt betrayed by in Spider-Man. They set you up, they had the twists and turns, and then they paid it off, and they ended that story. And yes, Superman came back and he had a mullet, and you know, maybe that wasn't great, but they gave you that complete story in this very grand mythic way. There was never that dip into like, all right, now we're just going to tell, you know, one-off continuing Superman stories, but it's going to be the Eradicator. Like, it was always part of this grander narrative. And the same thing with the Azrael Batman. Like, there was always this sense that it was proceeding toward some grand showdown. And they're doing the same thing now in Spider-Man. Literally, it's not quite the same time. It's like a year. I think Superman came back in 94. I think Superman and Batman both sort of recovered and came back in 94. And so this is happening in around 95, 96 in the Spider-Man titles. So it's weird that they're sort of doing the exact same story, but it's not as well planned and it's less satisfying, from at least from the standpoint of what I was looking for at the time, which was like, build, you know, set up your pins and then knock down your pins. Don't take this weird detour into like, now we're going to give you the everyday life of this dude working in a diner and like facing Spider-Man's same old foes.
Well, I think they got intoxicated by, it's almost like, good.
No, it was just a joke. Like what they did they have any, a couple of splash pages of him not getting tipped well and getting mad about it?
Kinda. I'm gonna be honest with you. Yes, like that was part
I
of the
don't remember
storytelling.
that, but that's amazing.
When they dyed his hair blonde and they gave him actually that super sweet new Spider-Man costume, like literally in the debut issue of the Spider-Man costume, there's story beats about him like getting into an argument with the cook at the diner and like not getting tipped, and like, you know, they very much tried to bring it back to that 70s Spider-Man of, you know, I'm going through the struggles of everyday life in New York City while also having to be Spider-Man. It just felt so hack. Even like as a young kid reading it, to me, it just felt like, this is boring. This doesn't amount to anything. Why are you doing this to me?
It's so interesting too, because, you know, I apparently in Marvel, everybody just wanted to end this. They've wanted to end the Clone Saga for a long time, but things just kept like happening for it not to end. And they were selling. So it was like, okay, well, we need to end this because all of the artists and creatives are unhappy about it. But we're also selling these, so we also need to keep making things. It's just like, it's so interesting that it turned into what it did. And I would like to address, could it have been good overall?
I think it started well.
Yeah.
You know, and again, not like Alan Moore level, but I think the general setup of this clone that you thought was dead survived, went and did his whole Bruce Banner in the 70s Hulk TV series, you know, living on the road, comes back because Aunt May is terminally ill and dies. And now he, you know, once he's back in New York, Spider-Man discovers that he's there and they have to wrestle with it. I think, again, the moment where it went off the rails, well, I won't even say that. Like, even the idea of you're the clone and I'm the real Spider-Man, interesting wrinkle. I think from there, they needed a more concrete plan for like, how are we going to bring this thing home? Because that is the point where it just turned into like, Spider-Man's living in Portland and like, just like, I don't know.
He's selling granola.
Yeah.
He's,
and Ben Reilly's working at a diner and dealing with not getting tipped well enough. And then meanwhile, it's like, Dr. Octopus's daughter shows up. And speaking of Spider-Verse, she was in that too. But like Dr. Octopus's daughter shows up. And then there's, you know, Silver Sable and the Sandman. And it's like, all right, now we're just going to parade old Spider-Man villains and same old Spider-Man stories. Like, what was the point of all this, right? Like, that was the thing. Even if they did the Norman Osborn, even if they had planned on the Norman Osborn thing from the beginning, which very much when it happened felt like, this is just like they literally were looking to pull something out of a hat to wrap it all up, and wasn't a bad card to pull out of the hat.
No,
it just wasn't. You could tell it was the Lost thing. Like, you could tell it was never planned. They're
like, how are we going to end this? Okay, right. Well, what if Norman Osborn comes back? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Let's make up some reasons for him to have come back. He's so mad about having been defeated that he has got to take the only revenge he can take, which is not actually beating him. It's actually just messing with his psyche. But it doesn't work because Spider-Man is too good at his heart.
Well, overall, yeah. And but the thing that messed it up for me in my rereading of it, besides, you know, I don't want to call things dated. I think that's like a whack diss, because like the classic things are dated to a certain eye. You know what I mean? So, but I will say the thing that puts it firmly in this time of under duress comics, as I've coined, you know what I'm saying? These guys, it was so apparent that these deadlines are punishing these guys. There was 3 companies ass episodes where Ben Reilly went to another smokestack and found another Spider-Man body with a mask on it and got freaked out. So he put it in a body bag and took it back to his apartment where Mary Jane and Peter were for some fucking reason. And they start having a conversation about this motherfucking body and what it kind of shows, like, maybe we're both not. And he's like, what do you mean, buddy? I'm the real, and all this kind of shit. And then there's a knock on the door. And Ben Reilly jumps up and goes, I forgot about my date with Janet. And Spider-Man and other Spider-Man try to box up the body real quick, and Mary Jane kind of runs interference, and they throw the body in the closet under a thing. And in their haste, one of the femurs from the body drops on the fucking ground, and Janet comes in, and they try to get in her face, and Ben Reilly kicks the fucking femur under the couch.
Wow,
that was a thing I read last night.
I do vaguely remember that.
I do too.
That also brings up, in terms of things that went off the rails, like, as I'm thinking back on it, this is the part that I think I just, intentionally block out of my mind. But in the middle there, when it was Peter and Ben Reilly both in New York trying to figure things out between them, the level of clone nonsense that they got into, which is what you're talking about, right? Like, not only was there Kane, not only was there Spider Side, which Ron mentioned earlier, which was like the T-1000 version of a spider clone. It was like the Jackal was just cloning everybody. Like, everybody was getting cloned. And there were so many clones running around. And every storyline had some new wrinkle about, like, what the clones are doing and who's being, like, at one point, Gwen Stacy comes back, but of course, no, it's a clone. And, like, there's just so much cloning. And that was also part of what just really, to be honest, when I was a kid, very hard to keep straight because they just did way too much with it. But on a conceptual level, I kind of loved it. That idea of, like, oh my God, they could just be making copies of people willy-nilly. But, like, again, it was a concept that they just did not know what to do with narratively. So they did everything with it. They did literally everything they possibly could. And it just felt so fat and bloated, again, even to a kid who thought it was cool at the time.
But also, can I just say this one thing? This thing. They also, in the process of trying to explain why that stuff was so fucking stupid, they wrote a whole shit ton of comics in between the pages. That's where, like, the lost years of Ben Reilly drawn by John Romita Jr. and stuff come in. That's where all these, like, and then like Liam Sharp drew some weird series about, like, the first time that Ben Reilly woke up and Jackal said some mean shit to him and he used his spider powers on him, and then he tried to brainwash him and he kept him in a room, and it was like a whole comic about Ben Reilly's first few days and how he got up the gumption to smack the shit out of the Jackal. He was like, I am human. He literally did that. That scene literally plays out. I am a human. And he throws the Jackal off and he jumps out the window, but he didn't have no web shooters. So he's just sort of daredeviling through the city. And he's just thinking about shit and trying to put his life together. But then the Jackal comes by in a jetpack and captures him. Like that, you never get that in the main continuity, but I read a comic last fucking night that filled in the gaps as if that was needed. It's like, this fatness spawned more fatness. This excess spawned more excess. It's so weird.
So we've talked about some good stuff. Actually, a lot of good stuff, actually, I would say. We actually have mentioned some good stuff. We've talked about a lot of bad stuff, too. So let's reboot this a little bit, guys. Let's do a reboot it. We'll keep it as short as possible.
I am not doing this just because we're going to get lost up our own asses. I'm sorry. I don't mean to.
That's
okay.
I think.
Well, not a reboot it. Then let's say how could they have tightened it up? Like, what could they have added or taken away to make it where the run was good?
Well, this is what I'm
overall good. And obviously better artists, but
Yeah, I mean, this is why I have that reaction though, because it's literally like you're asking, like, what could they have done? Keep in mind, okay, when
this is more like debooted, isn't it?
Well, when this is going on, there are, I want to say, 5 monthly Spider-Man comics.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're getting Spider-Man more than weekly. Plus, this is threading through, like, Venom miniseries, the New Warriors. I want to say that maybe even some Avengers stuff touched on this. So when all is said and done, you stretch that over the course of 5 years, hundreds of comics. This storyline, from the time Ben Reilly shows up to the time Ben Reilly crumbles to dust in Peter Parker Spider-Man number 75, is hundreds of comics. And the idea of like, well, let's dissect how we can do this better. Don't make it hundreds of comics. Like, I don't know how else to say that. I mean, it's like there's so many bits and pieces and tangents and elements to the story that are just there to take up time in that soap opera kind of way. It just becomes like, just get rid of all that. Just tell a story where the spider clone comes back. If you're going to have Judas Traveler and Scryer, give them a point. If you're going to have the Jackal, give him a point other than just, I want to clone everybody. And then
kill everybody first, though.
Whatever. Yeah, I mean, it was like...
He wanted to kill everybody with a virus, but then also have all of their genetic stuff so he could clone all of them to better versions of themselves.
Well, but also, let's just be fair. He had his own kind of well-written, creepy, real reason, which was Gwen Stacy. He was in love with his student. He wanted to create a scenario where he could be with her. Cloning, boning, dethroning, whatever the fuck he had to do to get to
That's
to
the
Gwen
new
Stacy.
run. Cloning, boning, dethroning.
You know, whatever he could do to get to that ass, he was going to do it. And he was all fucked up in his head because he's this old man using all these resources and whatever. So, yeah, I mean, that was cool. Not cool, but like, and not understandable. What can I say? Makes sense in the narrative of the comic books, yes, with his villainous personality.
Yeah.
And then they just spun it all around to all this extracurricular bullshit. So, yeah, I agree with Bill. You got to make it, you got to truncate it. And I think it would just be a limited series of what happened with this guy who thought he was Spider-Man or something like that.
So now there is, I haven't actually, when I was looking through Marvel Unlimited, the app that shall not be named, but I just did name, they have a later version of the Clone Saga that looks like it might be a shortened version. So maybe I'll read that, and later on we'll come back and talk about it. I'm not sure what it is.
Well, I was just gonna.
Ben Riley's been back. I mean, I don't know exactly how. Ben Riley's back. They've got to set up the apparatus that they would need to kind of. Again, these guys never die, just multiply colors, you know.
No, I mean, listen, the Jackal is, I want to say Ben Riley may have become the Jackal and like done some of his own cloning shenanigans, but Kane is back. Maybe Kane was the Jackal. Like all this stuff has come back in the past 5 years of Spider-Man comics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I will say this, even as we were talking about it, I'd love to see, you know how Ed Piskor did X-Men Grand Design? And it was sort of like, it was almost like a comic as an encyclopedia of the X-Men that literally took it from like X-Men #1 all the way to the present day. How do we just reconcile this as one story of real people over that whole time period? It'd be fascinating to do that with Spider-Man, just because you could excise or downplay so much of that other shit that was going on in the Clone Saga, and probably could end up with a somewhat compelling story if you just focused on the good parts.
Yeah, well, it's a six run series. There's 6 of them.
Yeah,
2009, 2010.
So, but yeah, just focusing it, and again, I as a capping, I think it was very astute of Ron to bring it up earlier about the fact that like this got us used to multiple Spider-Men. This got us used to. It wasn't a multiverse; they were all in the same universe. But you understand what I'm saying? They were all these different takes on it, these different twists of fate, these different twists on the origin, these different twists on what this personality does under such and such sort of duress or non-duress across different platforms, different incarnations. I think that was very important to the appeal of Spider-Man, because to that point it was like Spider-Man and Spider-Woman. And occasionally they would do some shit where he got to have a kid or whatever. Around this time, they start to do the thing where he actually does have a kid, and they kind of explore that a little bit.
Oh yeah.
And it's just like that's a major contribution to me, because Batman always has an ability to have 15 books. If Batgirl has a book and Robin has a book, and that means Batman has all these books.
Sure.
And it gave Spider-Man that same power, even more so. And I think it remains to this day. Like Spider-Man can have 5 monthly books under the strains we're under now. You know what I'm saying?
And I would go even further than that, Ed. I mean, yes to all that, and also this was the first time I think, that somebody had pulled that trick of like, let me dive really deep back into continuity and sort of try to recontextualize an old story for the modern day.
Yeah, what we call the
it off.
Grant Morrison.
Exactly. And that's my point. Like, Grant Morrison did that to unbelievable effect in his long Batman run, where, I mean, the whole thing was predicated on this idea of like, let me take these goofy stories from the 50s and 60s and integrate them into the Batman that we know now. Did something similar sort of thing with the X-Men, maybe not quite the same, but like just that idea of, all right, we're in this modern context where like the way we look at all these properties is different. How do we, in continuity, start to make sense of some of the stuff that they were doing 30 years ago? I think that the comic industry as a whole has gotten a lot of mileage out of that. And it started with the Clone Saga, for better or for worse.
All right.
Yep.
So that's I think that's us wrapping up. I think it's pretty clear that like no matter where you jump in on comics, if you look at it with the right attitude and learn from it to make it better and to further creative purposes, then it's done its job. I mean, the Clone Saga did a bunch of things that would not exist today without the Clone Saga being what it was. So you take its crappy parts and you go, okay, well, nobody's perfect.
It really shines a light on the difference between monthly comics and graphic novels.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's been such a movement over the past 10 years to really try to pick out the cream of the crop of comics. Like, what are the evergreen stories that stand the test of time, like The Dark Knight Returns? I'm never going to say don't pay attention to those, because you absolutely should. And I love comics as art in that way. But the flip side of comics is the churn and burn, disposable, cheap monthly entertainment that isn't written to be literature, but is written to capture kids' imaginations. And there is something very cynical to that, right? Because at that point, they're just loss leaders for these larger franchises to sell you more shit. So I'm not trying to defend it, but you have to understand that like that was comics going back to the 1930s, right? Like that is how comics started. And that is the tradition in which things like the Clone Saga were written. So you have to be able to put it into that proper context and just understand that like the Clone Saga, the Death and Return of Superman, Batman Nightfall, you know, Age of Onslaught, Age of Apocalypse, Heroes Reborn, which weirdly was happening the same time as the Clone Saga, leading into Marvel's bankruptcy, which is like a whole other conversation we could have. None of this stuff is meant to be Watchmen, right? Like nobody greenlights it thinking this is going to be Watchmen, but that's not really the function of the companies. Like that's not their business model, is to just churn out Watchmen. So before hating on it too much, understand that really its only function was to capture people like me and get them buying more comics. And in that function, it did its job. So hate on it from a creative standpoint, but understand that like it has an important place in comics history for reasons that have more to do with like fulfilling that sort of long-standing modus operandi of comics, as opposed to being the greatest art or the greatest story you've ever seen.
Yeah, you don't get Spider-Verse without, you know, Ben Reilly being really sad, wrapped in a cocoon of webs on his roof.
No, you can't have a multiverse omelet.
Or was that Peter Parker? I can't remember. It's all confusing.
You can't have a multiverse omelet without breaking some clone eggs. So
exactly.
There you go. So this has been another episode of an amorphous entertainment thing that we're doing. And this is a part of our Influences series. So thank you very much for joining us.